Good evening. It's Friday, April 2nd, 2010. I'm Lauren Lister. You're watching RT. Thanks so much for joining us. In our top story tonight, Colombian officials are finding thousands of bodies buried in mass graves just outside a Colombian military base overseen by the United States. Now, the graves are located in La Macarena, just outside a Colombian army base. It's one of 7 military facilities the United States has access to, and U.S. military advisors oversee this particular base. Now, the Colombian army is claiming responsibility for the killings. Army officials say the bodies belong to guerrillas, but local civilians aren't buying it. Residents claim these are innocent victims and loved ones who disappeared over the last few years. Some experts and a human rights group believe the Colombian military knowingly murdered these people and dressed them up to look like guerrillas to justify more aid from the U.S. Now, officials found these graves accidentally after children started getting sick from water in a nearby stream. Now, an investigation is planned. However, the original whistleblowers have now become tight-lipped for fear of their safety. These mass graves are raising serious questions for both Colombia and the United States, including what is the U.S.'s own conduct in the country, and should the U.S. be rethinking the $7 billion in military aid they've given to Colombia. Well, joining me to shed light on this entire situation is anthropology professor at American University, Adrian Pine. Thank you so much for being here. Now, can you talk a little bit about the false positive scandal that the Colombian government is currently embroiled in and how it relates to these mass graves?
Yeah, the false positives refer to people who are allegedly FARC militants or allegedly insurgents, but in fact are innocent civilians who have been killed by the Colombian military, which is receiving a huge amount of U.S. aid. And in order to understand this, we have to look back to Plan Colombia, which has been in effect since 2000. In that period, Colombia has received $6 billion in U.S. aid, 80% of it military, and that was with the goal of reducing the amount of coca production by 50% in 5 years. Coca is still at the same level that it was in 2000, so it has failed at its goal at reducing drug production. But in addition to that, there was the aim of attacking the insurgents, in particular after 2002. So the United States government has been directly involved in military training and assistance to the Colombian military for rooting out insurgents. However, in that same period, from 2000 to 2002, the FARC diminished significantly. But meanwhile, the soldiers get paid depending on how many FARC insurgents, how many guerrillas they kill. So there's a pay incentive for killing people, for bringing in bodies, but there were no longer the bodies to bring in. So what did the military do? They started killing civilians so that they could continue justifying the aid that they were getting from the United States military.
Right, and it's believed that this mass grave, now it is pending investigation, that could be the situation here. It's a huge deal, but we haven't really heard about it in the mainstream U.S. media, and I'm curious if you have an idea of why that would be.
Well, I think the mainstream U.S. media has an interest in not portraying the United States negatively. All of the involvement in the United States abroad in a negative light, because the United States has been so crucial in its efforts in Latin America in supporting United States business interests abroad. And I think one thing that's important to point out is that the link is so tight between the U.S. and the military. Over 10,000 Colombian soldiers have received military training at the School of the Americas in Fort Benning, Georgia. So the United States and Colombian connection is incredibly tight, and I think the media is not reporting honestly on what's going on.
Wow. Okay, well, in this investigation, if it does show that, in fact, these were not guerrillas that were killed, but that they were civilians, how large of a human rights violation would this be when you look at it globally, in your opinion?
Well, I mean, this is a massive human rights violation directly tied into U.S. foreign aid. We're talking about 1,700 cases that are currently under investigation. However, the Attorney General's office in Colombia, which is funded by the United States, has not been acting on this. And so it's a huge human rights violation, massive, but but it's not being acted on. And it makes you wonder why the United States is continuing with the massive amount of aid to Colombia when none of the stated goals for Plan Colombia are being met.
Are there any indications that they're rethinking this aid now upon this news, or with what you're saying, that they haven't made a lot of progress on the goals that they had in the country?
Quite to the contrary. And I would say what this tells us is that the United States actually didn't have these goals in the first place. The aid that they're bringing in include 7 new military bases. So there's a huge new influx of military aid to Colombia rather than addressing the issues.
Right, and you mentioned it would be a huge human rights violation, and you wonder how critical the U.S. has been to countries like China over human rights violations, and if it's not a little hypocritical that, meanwhile, they've put $7 billion into a country that could have done this. Thank you so much for giving us your insight.